So, imagine a public street where stepping onto the wrong block gets you taxed or, interrogated, or even beaten based entirely on your ancestry.
Right, which is a terrifying thought.
Yeah, completely. And, you and I might look at that and simply call it a gangland. We'd call it organized crime.
Sure, just standard criminal behavior.
Exactly. But the highly provocative text we are diving into today looks at that exact same street and calls it something entirely different. It calls it a miniature sovereign state. It calls it a colony.
Which completely reframes how we look at power, doesn't it? I mean, we are so used to thinking of colonization as something out of a history book.
Yeah, like wooden ships and
European flags, right? Monarchs drawing lines on a parchment map.
yeah.
We think of it as a historical event.
Right, something that happened in the past with a very specific, aesthetic to it.
Exactly. But the author of this text argues that we have been completely blinded by that historical aesthetic. Like we are so focused on the paint job of the car that we aren't looking at the engine under the hood.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, and if you pop the hood and look at the actual mechanics of how humans claim space, how they enforce borders, and how they extract resources, you realize that colonization isn't a historical event at all.
Right.
It is a universal architecture, and it is happening right now in our neighborhoods, in our institutions, and even in our language.
Which is just, that is the massive paradigm shift we are unpacking today. So welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
We are exploring a fascinating, deeply challenging piece of structural analysis today titled The Universal Architecture of Domination, Colonization Beyond Race.
A heavy title.
Very heavy. And the goal here is to explore how this author systematically dismantles our modern everyday definition of a colonizer and then reconstructs it from the ground up based purely on mechanics.
But before we go any further into those mechanics, we really need to set some very clear ground rules for today's session.
Yes, absolutely. This is crucial for you, the listener, to understand right up front. The text we are unpacking today is, well, it's a lightning rod.
It really is.
It takes direct aim at deeply ingrained historical institutions. It analyzes left-wing movements, it scrutinizes right-wing movements, and it dives straight into the most complex, highly charged racial dynamics in modern society.
Right, and because of that, we want to make our position completely transparent. Our goal today is not to tell you if the author of this text is right or wrong.
Nope, not at all.
We are not taking sides. We aren't endorsing these viewpoints, and we aren't condemning them either.
Think of us strictly as your impartial cartographers today. Our only job is to map out the exact architecture of the author's argument.
We're just laying out the blueprint.
Exactly. We are going to explore the logic, look at the evidence they present, and help you understand how all these gears fit together so that you can decide for yourself what to make of it. We are leaving our own personal opinions at the door.
With that firmly established, we can look at what this text is fundamentally trying to achieve. It is, at its core, an exercise in structural observation.
Right.
It challenges you to look exclusively at the function of power rather than the pigmentation of the people who happen to be wielding it.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the author doesn't start with geopolitics or history, they start with the dictionary.
They do.
They start by arguing that the way we use the word colonizer today, specifically the modern accusation that, white people are colonizers, is actually a massive definitional error.
It is the foundational argument of the entire piece. The author insists that if we are going to use a word that carries the moral weight of colonizer, we have to know what the word actually means in a functional philosophical sense.
Well, that makes sense. You need a baseline.
Right. To do that, the text points to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Which is about as rigorous a baseline as you can get.
Exactly. And Stanford defines colonialism very specifically as a practice of domination. It defines it as the subjugation of one people by another.
Okay, subjugation.
Yes. And then the text cross-references this with Merriam-Webster, which defines colonialism around the political and economic domination or control over another people or area.
So domination is the key word here. But why spend so much time on dictionary definitions? What is the author trying to prove by anchoring us to Stanford and Merriam-Webster?
Well, what's fascinating here is how the author uses these definitions to basically strip away the modern political narrative. By looking at Stanford, the text insists that the controlling category of colonization is domination.
Not race.
Exactly. The controlling category is not race. It is not immigration. It is not the simple act of migrating to a new place, and it is certainly not whiteness or European ancestry. It is the specific, mechanical act of dominating another group.
Let me try to put an analogy to this to see if I'm tracking the mechanics here. Think of it like a referee blowing the whistle on a foul in a basketball game.
Okay, I'm with you.
The rules of basketball dictate that grabbing a player's arm or shoving them in the back is a foul. It absolutely shouldn't matter what color jersey the offending player is wearing, right?
Right, a foul is a foul.
A foul is defined by the physical mechanics of the action. So the text seems to be arguing that if the mechanics of domination are morally wrong when a white demographic executes them, then those exact same mechanics logically have to be wrong when any demographic executes them.
That is the precise logic. And the author goes further to explain why corrupting this definition is so dangerous.
How so?
Well, if society decides that the word colonizer only applies when white people move to a new neighborhood, or, when they build businesses, or when they participate in public life.
Like if the label is exclusively reserved as a permanent tag for one specific demographic.
Exactly. Then the word has lost its meaning entirely.
Because it stops describing an action.
Exactly. It stops being a verb, right? Something you do,
Right.
and it becomes an inherent trait, something you are.
Wow.
Yeah. In philosophy and law, a real definition must apply universally to all humans. If you redefine colonizer to simply mean white person, you are no longer describing the act of domination.
You're just describing a person.
Right. You are essentially creating a linguistic weapon
Mm.
designed to silence a specific demographic by associating their very existence, their very presence in a space, with a historical crime.
So the text is setting up a universal standard, a ruler that measures behavior, not ancestry.
Precisely.
And the author is saying, look, there is more than one way to colonize a space. You have the old school, formal way, armies, forts, signed treaties, state power.
The historical aesthetic we talked about.
Right. But if colonization doesn't require a national flag or a formal imperial army, where do we actually see this universal architecture of domination playing out in the real world?
This is where the text introduces a vital concept, which it calls informal sovereignty.
Informal sovereignty. Okay.
The author argues that governing bodies don't always wear suits and sit in Capitol buildings. A government, functionally speaking, is simply any structure that successfully sets rules, controls access to a space, enforces penalties, extracts resources, and decides who belongs and who doesn't.
And if you apply that mechanical definition, you suddenly see informal governments everywhere.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
And the text takes us straight to the street level to prove it.
Okay, let's go to the street.
It argues that if a public city block land that is supposedly governed by the formal laws of a city becomes entirely unsafe for someone to walk down based purely on their race, that is not a localized crime wave.
It's something bigger.
Yes. And it certainly isn't liberation, no matter what political rhetoric might surround it. It is the establishment of racial territorial control.
The author gives a very stark example here, right?
Yes. The text says, imagine a public street where a white person cannot safely walk simply because he is white. The text argues that in that moment, public land, shared civic space, is being forcefully converted into controlled identity territory.
It is colonizing in its function.
Exactly. The group controlling the street is subjugating outsiders. And crucially, because the author demands universal definitions, the text emphasizes that the principle cannot change based on the color of the group doing the intimidating.
So it swings both ways.
It has to. The exact same logic applies if a white group makes a black person unsafe on a public block in a different part of the city.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The text doesn't just rely on hypotheticals. It brings in hard data from the FBI's 2021 to 2024 gang activity report.
Yes, it grounds the theory in federal data.
Right, and the FBI uses a Department of Justice definition for what a gang actually is.
And let's look closely at how the DOJ defines them, because it's very revealing. The Department of Justice defines gangs as associations of individuals who adopt a group identity to create an atmosphere of fear or intimidation, using violence to preserve power, reputation, and economic resources.
Okay, but I have to push back here because this feels like a massive leap the author is making.
How so?
Well, we usually think of gangs strictly as criminals, right? They are lawbreakers who sell drugs or steal cars. To call a street gang a colonizer or a miniature state sounds, I don't know, a bit dramatic. How does the text differentiate between mere street crime and actual colonization?
It's a great question, and the difference really comes down to that concept of sovereignty. The author argues that a mere criminal breaks the law to benefit themselves in the moment.
Like stealing a television.
Right. They aren't trying to replace the law. They are just trying to evade it.
They grab the TV and run away.
Exactly. But a governing body, even an informal, illegal one like a gang, doesn't just break the old laws. It establishes a new set of laws.
It claims geography.
Yes, when a gang sets rules on who can sell what on a specific corner, when they enforce invisible borders with lethal violence, when they collect extortion money from local bodegas.
Which is functionally just taxation without representation.
Precisely. They are extracting resources and providing protection in return. They are functionally governing that block.
Wow, okay.
And the FBI report points out something vital. Gang-related reporting doesn't always collect offender citizenship or even gang affiliation in a neat, tidy way. This isn't a clean racial database the FBI is working from.
It's a database of conduct.
Exactly. It's a record of how power operates where the formal state has failed.
So when the official police force steps back or, loses control of a neighborhood, a new sovereign power steps in to fill the vacuum.
Instantly. Nature abhors a vacuum, and power dynamics abhor unguarded territory. The text offers what it calls a simple test to determine if a structure on the street is exercising informal sovereignty.
What's the test?
You don't ask about their historical grievances. You ask 4 mechanical questions. Who controls the physical space? Who may enter that space safely? Who is punished for trespassing? And what specific identity marks someone as an outsider?
And if the answer to that last question, the marker of an outsider, is racial?
Then the structure is exercising racial sovereignty. It is colonizing that specific geographic space using identity as its border wall.
The street is a perfect example because it just strips away all the polite political language and academic theory.
It reveals the bare, undeniable mechanics of territorial control.
But, the text argues that the street is only a partially closed system. A gang might control a block, but people can still theoretically drive away, or the police can do a massive sweep.
Right. The borders are porous.
Exactly. So to see this architecture of informal sovereignty in its absolute purest, most concentrated form, the author takes us out of the open city and into the locked ecosystem of the American prison system.
Yes. The text refers to the prison system as the laboratory of raw sovereignty.
And the scale of this laboratory is staggering. The data cited here is heavy. The Bureau of Justice Statistics reported over 1.25 million people in state and federal prisons at the end of 2023.
A massive population.
Huge. And the Federal Bureau of Prisons reports inmate race statistics on a weekly basis.
The state meticulously tracks these demographics, but the author's focus isn't really on the state's record keeping, it's on how the inmates organize themselves.
Right.
Inside these concrete walls, the text points out that American prisons are completely dominated by racialized and ethnicized power blocks.
We're talking about groups with profound structural control.
Absolutely. The text lists several to illustrate the universality of this behavior. You have the Aryan Brotherhood, the Black Guerrilla Family, the Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, Latin Kings, Bloods, Crips.
It's across the board.
Yes, and the author is incredibly careful to note that the point here is not to point a finger and say, only black prison gangs do this, or only white prison gangs do this.
It's the exact opposite of pointing a finger at one group.
Right. It proves that all human groups, regardless of their ancestry, are capable of producing brutal racial sovereignty when they are placed under conditions of extreme fear, resource scarcity, and violence.
Let's look at the specific mechanics of one of these groups, because the text highlights the Black Guerrilla Family, or BGF, using Department of Justice data to show just how formalized this gets.
It's very formalized.
The DOJ describes the BGF, which was founded in 1966 at San Quentin, as being organized along strict paramilitary lines. We aren't talking about a loose group of friends watching each other's backs.
No, not at all.
They have a formal charter, they have a code of ethics, they have an oath of allegiance that members must swear to, all operating alongside their drug distribution and criminal activities.
They are a shadow government operating inside the walls of the state's government.
But wait, let me pause and push back on this, because I think a lot of listeners might feel uneasy about calling prison gangs colonizers.
It's a jarring term for it, definitely.
Right.
Yeah.
If you look at the origins of these prison groups, aren't they fundamentally just survival mechanisms? I mean, you are thrown into a hyper-violent, terrifying environment where the guards often can't or won't protect you.
It's a failure of the state.
Exactly. It's like a Lord of the Flies. In that scenario, your racial affiliation isn't about some grand desire to conquer. It literally becomes your citizenship. It's your only shield from getting killed by other groups.
That's a very real dynamic.
So is it intellectually honest for the text to call that colonization, or is it just desperate, ugly survival?
This raises a profoundly important question, and it's exactly why the text uses the specific phrase, laboratory of raw sovereignty.
Okay, break that down.
Well, the author doesn't deny the survival aspect at all. In fact, the argument hinges on the fact that it starts as survival. The text clarifies that the point of looking at prison demographics is not to treat those numbers as proof of collective moral guilt.
So what is the point then?
The point is to observe the mechanism of what invariably happens when the official, formal state, in this case, the prison administration, loses moral or practical control over the yard.
Right, when the state fails to provide equal protection.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When that happens, what fills the void?
The inmates do.
Yes, but how do they do it? They don't form a utopian democracy. They instantly revert to identity-based governance. Race becomes the literal physical border you cannot cross in the cafeteria or the recreation yard.
If you sit at the wrong table, there is a physical penalty.
Yes. Your affiliation becomes your passport and your citizenship. The protection you receive from your group becomes the taxation you pay in loyalty or violence. And violence itself becomes the new jurisprudence, the new law.
So the survival instinct mutates into sovereign control.
Exactly. It's naked sovereignty. It proves the universal architecture the author is talking about.
It's stripping it down to the studs.
Right. The prison yard shows us the naked, skeletal form of what the open street can become when lawful public order fails. Equal law is completely replaced by tribal enforcement.
Which is a heavy thought.
It is. It demonstrates mathematically that the urge to dominate, to categorize humans by identity, and to fiercely control territory is a universal human capacity. It is not a genetic trait tied to one specific race or a historical anomaly tied to European ships. It is human nature under pressure.
Okay, so we've looked at the street and we've looked at the prison yard. But a gang controlling a city block or a yard is dealing with physical geographic territory. Like, if I step over this concrete line, I get hurt.
Tangible borders.
Right. But the text then makes a massive, highly complex shift. It argues that this exact same evolution, this mutation from self-defense and survival into sovereign colonizing control, doesn't just happen with physical land.
No, it goes much deeper.
It happens within invisible territory. It happens within ideological political movements.
This is where the text analysis becomes highly intricate and, frankly, very controversial. It maps the mechanics of physical geography directly onto ideological governance.
And the text starts mapping this out by examining historical political movements, specifically looking at the Black Power movement.
Right.
It references data from the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. And the Smithsonian notes that the Black Power movement historically emphasized racial pride, economic empowerment, and the creation of independent Black political and cultural institutions.
They emphasize self-reliance and self-determination far more than they emphasize integration into the existing white structures.
And we have to be very precise here about how the author frames this. The text explicitly states that this language, the desire for self-reliance, the urge to build your own institutions, is not automatically evil.
No, it is not inherently colonization.
Right. The author contextualizes this by reminding the reader that this desire came from a place of profound exclusion, state-sponsored humiliation, and systemic legal injustice.
Exactly. When the existing institutions refuse to let you in, wanting to build your own is a perfectly logical response.
And then the text looks at the Black Panther Party as the ultimate historical case study that contains both sides of this evolutionary coin.
It's a very clear example of the shift.
Yeah. If you look at Britannica and the National Archives, they note that the Panthers started fundamentally as an organization for armed self-defense against brutal police violence. They also provided community survival programs like free breakfast for children and localized health clinics.
And according to the mechanical definitions in the text, a people defending themselves from state abuse is entirely legitimate. That is not colonization. Self-defense against a dominant, abusive force is a basic, universal human right.
But the text notes a functional shift in the organization over time, right?
Yes, a very specific ideological shift.
Britannica records that the Panthers evolved from a self-defense group into an explicitly Marxist revolutionary group. They began calling for the arming of all African Americans, the release of all Black prisoners across the board, total exemption from the legal sanctions of white America, and sweeping compensation for centuries of exploitation.
So they moved from defense to demands of sovereignty.
Right. So my question for you, based strictly on the mechanics laid out in this source, is this. At what exact moment does an ideological movement cross the line? How do we know when a group goes from legitimately seeking equal protection under the law to demanding what the author calls permanent group sovereignty?
It is a razor-thin line, but the text synthesizes the mechanics beautifully. The line is crossed when a movement shifts its energy from fighting to dismantle an unjust, unequal system to actively building its own institutions that aim to replace equal, universal law with racialized power.
The text uses the term counter-colonization, doesn't it?
Yes, it becomes counter-colonization when the movement's philosophy says, we aren't just asking for a fair seat at the existing table of equal rights. We believe the table is irredeemable.
So we're going to build our own table.
We are going to build our own table. We are going to govern our own ideological spaces. We are going to control our own cultural production. And we alone will wield the sovereign authority to decide who is allowed to speak inside our boundary.
Wow. It shifts from seeking equality within the state to seeking a form of racial revolutionary sovereignty that competes with the state.
Precisely. And the author brings this structural analysis directly into the present day by examining the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement.
Okay, let's get into that.
The author is careful to note a distinction right away. The phrase Black Lives Matter, when used simply as a statement of human worth and dignity, is morally unobjectionable.
It's a statement of basic human rights.
Right. But the text isn't analyzing the slogan. It is analyzing the organization and its operational mechanics.
The actual structure of the group.
Yes, it looks at the organization's own published language, which describes itself as an abolition-centered foundation working both inside and outside the existing system.
And what are they aiming for, structurally?
The organization explicitly seeks a future divested from police and prisons while actively investing in Black liberation, separate policy change, and independent institutional power.
So how does the author apply the colonizer framework to this? Because, advocating for policy change is just standard politics, isn't it?
The text points out that this is an explicitly institutional governing project. And again, the author emphasizes seeking policy change is not automatically colonization. But the mechanical shift occurs when any movement, regardless of its racial makeup, seeks to fundamentally reshape public policing, public language, state education, tax funding, and cultural norms strictly through a singular, exclusive racial liberation frame.
When it demands that public resources be allocated based on racial identity.
Exactly. When it does that, it stops being a simple protest against an injustice.
It becomes a competing governance vision. It wants to govern the public square.
Yes. It becomes a movement seeking to govern the state's resources and dictate the rules of public behavior based entirely on an identity-centric philosophy. It demands that shared public life be reorganized around a specific racial framework.
And by the text's mechanical definition, organizing public space and resources by racial identity is the architecture of domination.
That is the core argument, yes.
Which brings us directly to a massive collision point. Because if these ideological movements desire to build separate governed institutions and redistribute resources based on identity, how does the actual formal state bureaucracy handle this?
It gets very messy very quickly.
Because the state is the ultimate arbiter of power and resources. This leads us right into the realm of institutional domination, looking at state education, federal opportunity programs, and the highly debated concept of historical repair.
This is where we see the architecture of domination overlap directly with official state power. It's one thing for a gang to control a street corner. It's another thing entirely when the federal government begins sorting its citizens by ancestry.
Right, the scale is completely different. The text explores this by looking at historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs.
And it brings in the legal history there, too.
It cites the Higher Education Act, which provides the legal and historical context. The Act notes that HBCUs were established before 1964 with the principal mission of educating Black Americans.
Which was a necessity at the time.
Exactly. They were established during a time of extreme, legally enforced exclusion from white institutions, although the text notes they were technically open to students of all races.
And just as with the Black Panthers, the text acknowledges the vital historical context here. HBCUs are not automatically framed as colonizing structures from their inception. They began as a deeply necessary act of repair and survival.
Right. When the state actively prevents a demographic from accessing public education, Building your own university is a structural necessity.
It's self-preservation.
Let me try another analogy here to visualize how the author moves from historical repair to modern institutional colonization. Think of a massive balancing scale, the kind you see held by Lady Justice.
Okay, visualizing it.
Because of a massive historical injustice like slavery and segregation, one side of the scale is tipped violently to the ground. It is completely asymmetrical.
Right, totally unbalanced.
The text seems to acknowledge that institutions like HBCUs or certain race-conscious opportunity programs started as necessary, heavy weights added to the other side of the scale to try and repair that exclusion, to forcefully pull the scale back toward a balance of equal opportunity.
That is a fair representation of the historical intent, yes.
But the argument the text makes is about what happens decades later. If you take those corrective weights and you permanently superglue them to the scale.
If you lock them in place.
Exactly. If you create permanent racial privileges or identity-based institutions that can never be removed, even after the law has been made equal, you haven't actually achieved a balanced scale of justice. You've just hardwired a brand new, formalized, asymmetrical imbalance into the machinery of the state.
That is a perfect encapsulation of the author's core structural argument. The principle of justice, according to the text, has to remain universal.
It can't be conditional.
Right. If race-named institutions or race-exclusive funding programs remain legally protected and celebrated forever, while identical white identity institutions or white-exclusive funding programs would be immediately and rightfully condemned by society as white supremacist.
Then society has engineered asymmetrical racial permission.
Exactly. The state is saying it is okay to govern by race as long as it's the correct race.
The author argues that historical repair can absolutely be justified in the short term, but permanent, ongoing racial privilege cannot be treated as morally untouchable just because it initially began as an act of repair.
And the text points to very recent massive legal battles to show how this exact tension is violently playing out in our institutions right now.
Yeah, it references the landmark 2023 Supreme Court ruling that struck down the race-conscious admissions programs at Harvard and the University of North Carolina.
A huge moment for this exact debate.
Absolutely. The court fundamentally held that allowing a student's race to be considered as a positive or negative factor in admissions decision-making violated the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution.
The Supreme Court essentially ruled that the glue had to be removed from the balancing scale.
That's a great way to put it. The text also brings up the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC.
What did they say?
Well, the EAC has issued warnings that corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI programs may cross the line into unlawful territory if employment actions like hiring or promotion are motivated in whole or in part by a person's race.
So the state is starting to push back on that asymmetrical permission.
Right. And the text also mentions federal programs like the Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Programs or the 8A program, where the government literally applies race-based presumptions of social disadvantage.
Oh, right.
In these programs, the state basically converts your physical ancestry into a tangible public benefit, like getting preferential treatment for a lucrative federal contract.
And this is where institutional colonization becomes visible and measurable to the author. When the state, or massive institutions closely adjacent to the state, like Ivy League universities or Fortune 500 DEI boards, begin to actively distribute economic opportunity and access based on group identity, they are no longer merely remembering history.
They crossed a line.
They have crossed a vital threshold. They're now actively governing the present by racial classification.
They are acting as a sovereign power, sorting the population.
Yes, sorting the population and distributing the nation's wealth and resources based on the exact same metric that the civil rights movement fought so hard to erase from the law, racial categories.
And the most formalized, extreme version of this state-sponsored sorting, according to the text, is the modern political push for reparations.
Yes, that's the ultimate example in the text.
The text explicitly points to H.R. 40. This was a bill introduced in the 119th Congress, which proposed a federal commission to study and develop systemic reparations proposals for African Americans based on the history of slavery and subsequent systemic discrimination.
Now, the author is careful to state that one can debate the historical merits of reparations honestly.
Right, there's a historical conversation to be had.
But the text asks us to look at it purely structurally, through the cold lens of governance and power dynamics. If you look at the mechanics of how a modern state would execute reparations, it is fundamentally a claim of inherited creditor status.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that phrase. Inherited creditor status. What does that actually mean in practice? Like, how does a state enforce that?
It means that you are legally owed a financial and moral debt simply by virtue of being born into a specific demographic group. Your ancestry makes you a creditor.
And if there is a
There
creditor.
must be a debtor. One group is permanently legally assigned the position of claimant or creditor. Another group, usually the rest of the tax-paying public, is implicitly assigned the permanent status of debtor,
With the state acting as the middleman.
with the state acting as the powerful collection agency, channeling the funds from one group to the other.
So it's not just a one-time apology check.
No, the text argues that structurally, this is not simply memory or historical healing. It is a massive, ongoing political economic demand placed on the entire national household, based purely on bloodlines and ancestry.
It's an attempt to use the ultimate hard power of the state to enforce a permanent financial and moral hierarchy based on identity.
And in the author's eyes, using the state to extract resources from one demographic to enrich another based on race is the ultimate architecture of formal colonization.
Okay, so we've explored the hard power. We've looked at how boundaries and rules are enforced by violence on the streets, by survival gangs in the prisons, by ideological political movements, by the Supreme Court, and by federal state bureaucracies.
That is all hard power.
But the source text argues that the most pervasive, the most omnipresent form of colonization happens entirely outside of courtrooms and prison yards. It happens in the soft power of culture, art, and language.
Soft power is often vastly more powerful than hard power, precisely because it doesn't look like governance.
It's invisible.
Right. Doesn't wear a badge. It looks like entertainment or neighborhood dynamics or the slang we use with our friends. It feels organic.
But the text argues that if you look closely, the exact same universal architecture of domination and border enforcement is present in our culture.
Yes. The text takes a really deep dive into the origins and ownership of hip-hop to illustrate this.
It references Britannica and the Smithsonian, tracing the birth of hip-hop directly to the predominantly African-American and Afro-Caribbean communities living in the economically depressed South Bronx in the late 1970s.
And the author states very clearly, that origin story is historically undeniable and deserves immense cultural respect.
Right. The issue the text raises is not that Black communities helped create hip-hop. They absolutely did.
So what is the issue?
The structural issue the text zeroes in on is what happens decades later, when that historical point of origin is forcefully transformed into a claim of permanent, exclusive racial property. Right? The text asks what happens to the culture when white participation in a genre is instinctively treated as cultural theft or appropriation, or when white criticism of the genre is automatically dismissed as racism simply because of the critic's race.
The author points out that if a musician has to pass a racial authenticity test, meaning their art is judged by their ancestry rather than their talent, while artists of the origin race do not have to pass that same test, then culture has ceased to be a shared human experience.
It has become governed territory.
It's an invisible border wall built around a music genre.
Exactly. You are socially regulating who can speak, who can sing, who can critique, or who can profit based entirely on their ancestry.
And language itself is where the text gets incredibly sharp. It zeroes in on the use of the N-word as the ultimate example of invisible cultural borders.
The text points out a very specific, undeniable dynamic. The exact same mouth making the exact same phonetic sound, saying the exact same sentence in the exact same context is judged entirely differently by society depending purely on the racial pigmentation of the speaker.
The text labels this phenomenon racialized speech sovereignty.
Let's talk about how that border is actually enforced, because there is no formal law against saying a word, but the punishment is severe.
The enforcement is psychological and social, which is often more devastating than legal enforcement. The text introduces the concept of caste speech logic.
Caste speech logic.
The author acknowledges that people will immediately argue that the horrific history of slavery and the weaponization of the word explains the modern asymmetry of who is allowed to say it.
The historical context is usually the end of the debate for most people.
Yes, and the author says, fine, history explains how the dynamic started. But functionally, structurally, right now in the present day, it operates as a rigid system of racial permission.
Think about how a society enforces it without a formal court.
Right. If a person of one race uses the word, it's a song lyric or a term of endearment. If a person of another race uses the exact same word, they face total social ostracization, career destruction, and public shaming.
It functions like an invisible caste system applied to human vocal cords.
Precisely. If one race possesses total linguistic immunity and another race faces severe social and economic prohibition for the exact same physical action, then speech itself has been colonized by identity.
Wow.
It is the psychological weight of knowing you live under an unequal rule set. It is not equal law. It is a caste system governing language.
The text also looks at physical enclaves, and you see the same tension between origins and ownership. It mentions Chinatowns.
Right, which have a very specific historical origin.
Exactly. The text uses data from the Library of Congress to explain that Chinese immigrants historically built these dense, self-reliant communities in direct response to severe hostility, economic hardship, and formal legal exclusion in America.
So the existence of Chinatown isn't domination.
No, it's a profound testament to mutual aid, protection, and survival in a hostile environment.
This is a crucial distinction the author makes. Demographic density is not domination. A neighborhood happening to be predominantly one ethnicity is not colonization. A cultural hub is not a colony.
So when does it become one?
The structural shift occurs the moment the refuge mutates into territorial sovereignty, only if that enclave becomes explicitly exclusionary, coercive, or politically untouchable.
Give me an example of the mechanics of that shift. When does Chinatown cross the line?
It crosses the line if the enclave collectively decides that outsiders are socially or economically prohibited from opening businesses there simply because they aren't Chinese.
Okay, I see.
Or if they demand that the standard laws of the broader city do not apply inside their borders due to their unique ethnic identity. That is when the enclave stops being a refuge and becomes colonizing in its function. It begins enforcing borders based on identity.
The text applies this exact same logic of demographic dominance versus structural domination to professional sports.
It does, yes.
It cites ESPN data, noting that in the 2022 to 2023 season, over 70% of NBA players were African American. It also cites a Harvard football players' health study that tracks how NFL demographics shifted dramatically from being predominantly white in 1960 to being predominantly black in many skill positions today.
And again, the author's point is that this sheer demographic dominance is not a structural problem. Excellence on the court, specialized talent pipelines, the free market dynamics of sports, none of that is domination.
Earning a spot on a team through superior athletic ability is the opposite of colonization. It's merit.
Exactly.
So when does sports culture become colonized territory?
It only becomes a structural issue when demographic dominance on the field mutates into cultural ownership claims off the field. It happens when fan identity or sports commentary or ownership structures are racially policed.
So if someone says you can't critique this player's style because you aren't black and you don't understand the culture, that is enforcing a border.
Precisely. When the culture surrounding the sport demands racial immunity from criticism or asserts that only one specific demographic has the inherent right to fully participate in, analyze, or profit from the culture of the game, they are attempting to exert sovereign control over a shared human activity.
Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground here, from the granular definitions in the dictionary to the sprawling complexities of the prison yard, the Supreme Court, and the basketball court.
It's a lot to process.
It really is. Let's pull all these theoretical threads together. The central driving thesis of this entire essay is incredibly clear, and it hits like a hammer. Colonization is about domination, not pigmentation.
That is the ultimate takeaway. The author is demanding that we return to a universal standard of human behavior. A white person is not a colonizer simply because he was born white. A black person is not a colonizer simply because he was born black. But any group, any human collective, regardless of their historical background or the color of their skin, can perform colonizing functions.
They become colonizers the moment they claim sovereign space?
Yes. The moment they control access based on identity, impose an unequal hierarchy, extract resources from outsiders, rewrite language to serve their group, punish those who cross their invisible borders, and demand moral immunity for their actions.
So a black street gang can colonize a block. A white street gang can colonize a block.
Exactly.
A Hispanic cartel can colonize a transit corridor.
Yeah.
A corporate DEI office can colonize an institution if it replaces equal, merit-based treatment with racial sorting. A political movement can colonize public morality by demanding ideological obedience. And a music scene can colonize culture by enforcing racial authenticity tests.
The architecture is universal. The gears of power turn the exact same way, no matter who is pulling the lever. And this leads to the final, hard-hitting stance of the text.
What's the final stance?
If the word colonizer truly means the act of domination, then we must apply it to every domination structure, equally, regardless of the race of the people running it.
And if we refuse to do that,
If society decides that the word colonizer only ever means white person, then the author argues it was never a historical, philosophical, or structural term to begin with.
yeah.
It was simply racial propaganda designed to silence one group while providing cover for others to build their own empires.
Wow. And this brings us directly back to you, the listener, because unpacking a text like this isn't just an abstract academic exercise. It isn't just about debating history.
Oh, it's very present.
It's a direct challenge to how you view the world around you right now. This deep dive challenges you to look at the structures in your own daily life.
Look closely at your workplace. Look at the dynamics in your neighborhood. Look at the political communities you participate in online.
And when you look at them, ask yourself the universal moral test the text provides. Does this structure dominate, subordinate, exclude, extract, or govern based on human identity?
If the answer is yes, then regardless of who is in charge, regardless of their historical grievances, and regardless of their stated intentions, that structure is colonizing in its function.
We started this deep dive talking about maps, about how comforting it is when boundaries are visible, when they are drawn in solid black ink by official governments and signed treaties.
But as we've seen today, the most powerful borders in our society are rarely printed on paper.
They are invisible. They are drawn by culture, enforced by language, and maintained by the quiet, everyday mechanics of informal sovereignty.
And we're all navigating these invisible maps every single day, whether we realize it or not.
Which leaves us with a final, lingering question to ponder long after this audio stops playing.
It's a big one.
If this text is right, if every single human group across all of time and space has the exact same mechanical capacity to colonize, to dominate, and to claim identity territory when given the chance and the power, is the urge to dominate simply an inescapable, hardwired part of human nature?
Or is it truly possible for us someday to build a society completely free of identity territory?
That is the ultimate question we have to answer.
It really is.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.
Yeah.
Keep questioning the map. We'll see you next time.